In a Shallow Grave by James Purdy. What you will need now you are about to be separated from the army, my captain had told me as I was picking up my mustering out pay, is what in the days of my grandfather they called a valet, or maybe a hired man. Unless, of course, you want to stay in the vet's hospital, which you have more than every right to do, but you'll need someone to watch over you now. I didn't think about a valet or hired man until I was back home in Virginia for a week or so. Somehow, all I thought about the first few days was how many birds there were singing in the early pre-morning hours. I never heard such a fuss. I thought some, too, about my parents, who had died whilst I was in service. And I thought about somebody else who I'm coming to very presently. I felt also a certain kind of angry satisfaction, if not gratitude, for all the money I had on hand, not to speak of some my uncle had willed me. I say angry or grim satisfaction owing to the fact that both the captain and me knew there would be no valet, hired man, even slave, who would want to come and stay with me, not to mention eat with or touch me. For I may as well explain at once that, owing to my war injuries, which took place near the South China Sea, my appearance is such that anybody's stomach is turned at the sight, enough to make him throw up, if not to faint. I kept sort of grinning, thinking over the captain's advice about valets and servants and hired men, but as another soldier, who was being mustered out at the same time as me, had quipped, "When you can't even find somebody to shine your shoes anymore, let alone somebody to watch over you." But behind all these practical considerations and worries, there was this flitting dim thought about, never absent, but never put into words at that time, that down the road about 2 miles, was living Widow Rance, who had been, though this seems 1,000 years ago, must surely have passed out of her mind entirely, my childhood sweetheart. But though I thought of her every moment, asleep or awake, under the sound of all these bird choirsters, it finally wasn't my lifelong crush on her that made me hold my breath with panic, but what was I to do with the little that was left of myself? The army doc, just before he signed my papers, had said, "Although your skin bears a total disfigurement from your war injuries, you ought to bear in mind, despite your outward appearance, you have a wonderful, fine, and strong bone structure, and it is the bones that are the real measure of a man's bearing and good looks." In the darkness now, sometimes after my return, I would take out a large hand mirror and look at myself, as if searching for the bones that he had said I should be so proud of. By midnight, it is true, I looked sort of almost normal, the scars, gashes, and the discoloration sort of melting into the night. Yes, I needed a servant. I kept returning to this. No woman would take the job, that's certain, though I would have preferred one. It would have to be only a man, but a young one. For already, you see, I had my plan, and I would run his legs off. So I put some notices in the local papers advertising for him, for I knew that when I would court the Widow Rance through these letters, I was going to write her. But it was maybe my greatest sorrow, since I was hurt so bad in the war, when the ads started to be answered, and the applicants began coming in person. I had never interviewed anybody before, and always been the one to have answer the questions, and here I was about to ask these young men if they would care to accept employment. But there were few questions asked, let me tell you, and almost no answers, for all the young men acted the same way. That is, they took one look, and their gorge started to rise, and they would strain and cough, wanting to vomit as they looked over me. After that, they would get up, knocking over a stool or tabouret somewhere, some mumbling, "No thanks, buddy," or "Sorry about you and all your troubles over there." One even started to shake hands with me, but when he saw the disfigurement had reached as far down as my fingertips, he thought better of it, and hiked out faster than the ones who had left almost as soon as they had caught sight of me. I am glad the doc has left me a generous medicine cabinet, for as soon as an applicant had retched and knocked over the furniture and hurried out, I would take more than my usual handful of pills. I presided over 50 acres here, left me by my grandfather, who in turn had it from his father. Nearby is the ocean, which sort of follows my moods. That is, sometimes even when the sky is bright, he thunders and thumps and howls and even cries like a little child. And speaking of crying, my doc says my injuries have not really damaged my lacrimal glands, but I think on this score, as on many others, he must have blundered, for I cannot weep. And if I start to, I feel a great pain in these said glands, like there were sharp rocks or millstones being drawn through raw nerves. I don't know what I would do without the ocean, come to think of it. At first I wrote down in diary form my thoughts, but I burned them one morning. The pages from my diary, though, began with one sentence, which from then on seemed to float through the air like smoke rings from a billboard cigarette. I am the color now of mulberry juice. It's as though any chair I sat on was a red-hot stove. My bed is like ground glass, and even when walking from my scalp down to my big toe, I feel I am on fire. It is memory, said the docs. You have recovered from your war injury. It is your memory which keeps you in pain. Learn to forget, and you will be well again. But if I do have memory, like they say, it is buried to the core of the earth, for I really have trouble recollecting one day from the next. The interviews and the advertisements for hired help took all of a year. Even now I can see the long line of young men who came to apply for a job nobody could want. I thought once, and wrote it down on a scrap sheet from a ledger, the lowest slave in the world wouldn't accept the job of tending me if he was to starve to death. Only it finally came to me in the night that somebody desperate was going to apply. And as soon as this thought warned me of his coming, I got sort of quiet, even for me, and slept. There was a little pump organ upstairs, and I used to go up and pump it and play folk songs on it, and even sing, but it only made me more uncomfortable in my head, for the purpose of folk songs, whether they admit it or not, is to get you to weep. None who came then as applicants could bear the sight of me. All turned aside to retch or to groan or to sit down, too faint to stand, and would beg for a glass of water. The hired girl I had at this time used to let them in and almost as quickly let them out. One applicant, who lingered a little longer than the others, while the girl waited at the door to allow him to leave, opined that when winter came, he feared the house would be too skeletal and thin to keep the big wind and ocean blast out. I nodded, as cold was the last thing on my mind, and I reminded him that in summer it is breezy and cool here, when the rest of the country is sweltering and broiling. All the time the applicants was coming and going, I was thinking, if only I could lay my head in her, Widow Rance's, lap. My brow and brain would get cool, my lacrimal glands would work, and I would be my old self. Your old sweet self.